Hey, what's going on YouTube? So this is a continuation from my previous video, creating a download link. And in the previous video, I did a basic version of this. This is a more advanced version of creating a download link. So if you haven't seen the basic version, I suggest you go back and give it a watch. But if you just want to start off with a more advanced stuff, then this is the video for you. In video number 1, we went over the basic implementation of creating a download link and creating a file on the fly using Web APIs Blob. Now in that video there were a few things that I wanted to change and refactor, and we're going to be doing that in this video here, which is the more advanced version of it. So let's get started. Alright, so some of the issues from the last video that we wanted to address was removing global variables, these guys that you see here. Second was adding validation and error checking to our main method that we have here. This method does a bulk of the work. And then lastly, we wanted to remove hard-coded values. So we see some hard-coded values here. All right, so we're looking at our more advanced code here. So the first thing that we wanted to tackle were globals. Now for globals, it was simply a matter of adding namespacing. Now you can see some namespacing here on lines 3 and 4. And this should sort out any issues that we're going to have with running into name collisions. Now, line number 3 here, you can think of this as a root variable. Just say this represents the application. And then line number 4, we can say this kind of represents a function or some functionality in the application itself. And this type of namespacing you can use to categorize and separate out your logic based on functionality. So this here should tackle a good majority of any global namespace collisions that you might run into. So if we wanted to follow this convention here and say we wanted to add a global variable for data generator, it looks something like this. We declare a variable and then we do a check to see if it exists. If it does, we assign it to itself. If not, we create a new object. This here would represent any data generation functionality similar to download link functionality that we have up here. And as for this type of instantiation, lines 3 and 4, all this is saying here is look for on the fly. If it exists, assign it to itself. If you can't find it, then create a new object. And then we're doing the same thing here for on the fly.download link. All right, so let's move on here. Another thing I want to cover here is how we have this set up here. So think of on the fly as the application and think of download link as a module. And a module is just a piece of the application that does a specific thing. In this case, it creates a download link. Now we could easily specify another module like I showed you earlier called onthefly.dataGeneration, whose main purpose is to generate data. And modules are just a way to separate and organize your code by functionality. So here I'm using my module along with an IFFE. Now IFFE stands for immediately invoked function expression. Now an IFFE is just an unnamed function that's invoked immediately after it's been defined. And everything that's defined within the function can only be accessed within it. So it adds an extra element of privacy and encapsulation. Now the return section here lets you specify what you want to be public. So let me show you a quick example here. Okay, so I have JSFiddle open here, and JSFiddle is just a tool that I use to play around with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and a few other frameworks. It allows you to do everything online, so you're not required to set up a server. So a couple things here. I have my variable declaration, then I have my IFFE declaration here as well. We can see hidden var and inner. These are going to be private and only accessible within the context of this IFFE block here because it's not declared in the return statement down here. The only thing that's declared in the return statement is init. So this init function here is going to be the only thing that's public facing. So if we were to save this and run it, we can see public function tester is outputted, but then an error is thrown when we try to call my inner. So my inner is not a function, and this is because it's not able to see within the IFFE. This is encapsulated here, so anything outside of it can't see within it. If I was to take this inner function here and declare it in a return statement down here, this is now specify that both init and inner are now public facing. So if I save this and run it, we can see that inner function is being called. We're now able to access it because we're saying it's now public facing. And if I was to grab a hidden var down here, let's get rid of this. Let's try and output inner var. This should still be hidden, so we should see an error for that. And we do in fact see an error. The hidden var is not defined. And that's because once again, this is only visible within the context of the IFFE here, unless we decide to make it public facing. All right, so now we can jump back over to our code. All right, next we handle validation and error checking. So here I modified the init function to take in a configuration parameter, and I checked to see if the config options was passed in. If so, I set the default config options to those passed in the parameters. So we can look here at the config options here, and we see that a few of these have default values assigned to them. So if the user fails to provide these, then we're just going to use the defaults. However, for file name and file data, these are set to null. If the user doesn't provide these, then the validation is going to fail and error out. So these must be provided by the user. Our validation function down here, we look at isValid, it does a check against the values of the object, which is what we have up here. And the values is going to be everything on the right hand side of the colon. And then if any null values are found, then we know that our validation failed and the user failed to provide one of these two here. So let's take a closer look at the isValid function down here. So here we're leveraging a couple built-in methods here. The values, which operates on the object, returning all the values, which is everything on the right hand side, and then array's built-in filter method here. And the built-in filter method just returns everything according to whatever criteria is set. So in this case, we're saying give us all null values or empty values. So we know that if the length is greater than 0, then we have null or empty values. If the length is equal to 0, then we have no null or empty values. And that's the case that we want. So we know that if this evaluates to false, then we found some empty values down here in our function. File name or file data could be null, or the user might have overwritten one of these other default values to be null. And if that's the case, then we want to throw an error message saying missing required config options. So that should take care of bulk of our error checking and validation. And if you wanted to take it a step further, you could also validate the config parameters passed in just to make sure the user hasn't overridden any of these default values to either null or undefined. All right, so moving on. So the last thing we wanted to tackle were hard-coded values. Now, config option also takes care of these hard-coded values. We provide defaults here and allow the user to override whichever of these values they wish to. So if the user wants to change a button label or MIME type or a char set, they simply have to override the value here and pass it into the init function. Like, we no longer need to duplicate code if we want the buttons to differ. So now let me show you an actual implementation. So I'm going to switch over to my index here. Okay, so this is where all the action is happening here. So we're calling an init method that we declared here in advanced.js. Let me comment out noob.js because we don't need that for this video. And in our init method, we're passing in our config options here. And notice how the config options differ between these two buttons. We're able to overwrite all the default values that we have specified here and specified here. So we no longer need to duplicate any code seen over here in our module. We can simply just specify the changes that we want in our config options. So if you want a different download label or a different file extension, all we have to do is pass those values here into our config options. So anything that's not specified here we'll use the default values seen here in our original config options. The only thing that we can't use default values for is file name and file data. Those are required. We need to provide those. All right, so I'm going to copy this. And then we're going to switch over to our browser here just to see everything in action. All right, so we have our browser open here. Let me do a quick refresh to show you. So the two buttons are created on page load, and that's because we called our init method twice with different config options. So if I do an inspect here, go to console, paste one of the existing ones. We're going to change this to sample, let's say sample 99, and change this to test payload 99. Press enter. You're going to see a new button created here. And if we download that payload there and open it up, you're going to see your test payload of 99 here. So let's open another one of these up. Some test text for you. And that's from the hard-coded payload that we had from before. If we open up yet another one. Oops, that one's off screen. And then this is just our CSV. And yet again with the minor formatting that easy to fix. I'll leave that up to you. And that's that for adding our buttons there. But let me zip back to the code. There's one thing I missed that I wanted to go over. Let's actually step through this entire thing. So the first thing we do here is we call our init method. We pass in our config options, overwrite any values that need to be overridden. Then we do a validation check just to make sure we have all the required values. Remember, file name and file data, those are required. Everything else we can use the default options for. And if we don't want to use the default options, we overwrite them in our config options. If the validation passes, we go down to execute the next line, which is attached download link. An attached download link takes an element created by build download link. So if we jump into build download link here, we can see it uses ES6 destructure to pull out the values needed to build the link and to build our blob. And those values are pulled from config option. This is the config option the user passed in, or the default value specified here. All right, so we'll create our blob here. And remember, a blob is just an immutable file-like object, and immutable just means the state can't be changed after you create it. And here we're just passing in our data, our payload, into an array. Then we create our element here. In this case, we're creating an anchor element. We're setting the attribute. We're creating our unique URL for a blob, setting the download label via inner.html. Then we set our download attribute, and we're passing in a file name. So when the user clicks on it, this allows us to specify what we want the file name of the downloaded file to be. So if we jump into here, you can see Generate file here is simply pulling out file name and file extension from our config options that we instantiated before, or that user passed in. And the last thing to do here is to add our styling for our buttons here, and it's passed in as an array. So if we take a quick peek at the class list here, we can see the class list is simply an array of strings here. So we scroll back down, we're going to check if it's an array. If it is, we're going to iterate over class list and then add each class to our link that we created up here. And then once that's done, we're going to simply return our link. And note that we're doing a check to make sure it's an array. We could probably easily add a check to say if it's not an array, then throw an error instead of just logging it out in the console here. So now that we've created our download link, it's just a matter of attaching it to our source element. We're going to go back up here to where build download link was called, which is that attached download link. And we're going to jump into that method there. And you can see it's just finding the source element and appending the newly created link to that element as a child. And if we take a peek at source element, we can see that it defaults to document.body. However, in index.html, we're passing in a value that's going to override the default value. And the value here is a div with a class container attached to it. So it's going to attach it to this div that you're seeing here. So that's going to be all you need to create a download link. And jump back here. So just to summarize, we went over removing global variables by adding a namespace. We went over adding error checking and validation. And then we also went over removing hard-coded values. And we remedied that by passing in a config option where the user was allowed to override the default values or just use the default values. That will end our video for today. And once again, don't forget to like and subscribe if you found this video informative and helpful. Leave a comment, let me know how you're feeling. Let me know if you're using any of this code, if you're using the basic version or the more advanced version. And don't forget to share this video. Until next time, catch y'all in the next video. Peace.